Hey everybody, I'm Zac.
And I'm Jesse.
And you're watching In Depth
On Now You Know. We're brought to you by abetterrouteplanner.com. Use our link in the show notes below to get a 30-day free trial to the premium app.
We are giving away a Porsche Taycan 4S.
Well, we aren't. Charity Stars is.
Well, that's right. You can win it by going to charitystars.com/nowyouknow and get this.
What?
If you use the code NOWYOUKNOW at checkout, you'll get 10 free entries on your purchase.
The Porsche Taycan 4S is a beast, able to do 0 to 60 in under 4 seconds, 155 mile an hour top speed with 2 motors and all-wheel drive, putting out 640 newton meters of torque. The driver has 4 screens and over 250 miles of range.
Now, Charity Stars is a groundbreaking fundraising platform that helps raise money for charitable causes, and the cause that you're supporting by going to charitystars.com/nowyouknow is War Child, which is protecting, educating, and standing up for the rights of children caught up in war.
Together with their partners, War Child works in 15 countries across Africa, Asia, the Middle East, and Latin America.
So head on over to charitystars.com/nowyouknow, help a great cause, and enter for your chance to win this awesome prize, the Porsche Taycan 4S. And don't forget to use the code NOWYOUKNOW when checking out to get 10 additional free entries and increase your chances of winning.
And we're just showing you a red Taycan, but you get to pick your color if you win.
Ooh, I would pick the volcano gray. No, the jet black. No, the cherry metallic. No, the Neptune blue. And we're also brought to you by BigBattery.com. No matter what you need to power, Big Battery can provide you with the latest battery tech at the best price per kilowatt hour guaranteed. Their batteries are easily installed, require zero maintenance, and they're made right here in the U.S. Pick up yours today at BigBattery.com and use code NOWYOUKNOW for 5% off at checkout. And now our interview with Eric Berger, author of LIFTOFF. Well, thank you so much, Eric Berger. The author of LIFTOFF is with us right now. And I just want to say before we get started, I highly recommend this book. We just read this book in our Now You Know book club. Everyone loved it. And in case if you're like worried and you're like, well, it's about rockets, it's going to be technical and boring, don't be worried. It's a page turner. In fact, we loved it so much that the talk on the book club turned to movie rights.
Almost immediately.
They were like, the number one question for Eric is, has he sold the movie rights? Because this is going to be a blockbuster. So I have to ask on behalf of our book club, have you sold the movie rights yet?
The answer to that is no. We have an exclusive deal with a different group to sell the rights to the movie. So it's being worked on. I don't know where it's going to go, if it's going to end up in anything. And if you're trying to cast Elon, remember he's like 30 years old when this began.
Right.
So you need to find a young actor.
Yeah, because we were thinking of Michael Fassbender. He might be a little too old now, I'm not sure. Although he's pulled off a lot of roles. We were also thinking of Bonnie Hunt for Gwynne Shotwell. But again, you're right. We have to go back in time, which makes it harder. All right. Well, we'll talk after the show. Maybe we can, work something out. This book reminds me of Apollo 13 meets October Sky meets The Right Stuff. Like, it's just such an exciting tale. It's such an important tale. And I mean, you got special access to write this. I mean, Elon kind of gave you his approval to talk to pretty much everyone and anyone at SpaceX, which makes your book really special. And first off, I just wanted to ask you, this is your first book, right?
Yeah, it's my first book. It's what a dream to write this one first.
How did you get that kind of access to a team that pretty much no one has access to?
I'd been specializing in space reporting for more than a decade, and Elon had come to like my work because he's not a big fan of journalists, but I sort of cover the space industry as it is, not as it's portrayed by the big aerospace companies. So I'm pretty pro-commercial space because I'm of the opinion that we ought to be out there doing as much as we can, as quickly as we can. And, space for a long time has been dominated by the large companies, the Boeings, the Lockheed Martins, the Northrops. They're happy to explore, but they're in it to appease shareholders, to get large government contracts. And people that fund them in Congress are there to employ people in their districts and accept campaign contributions from these companies. And that's how sort of the wheel has turned for decades. And so SpaceX had sought to disrupt that, and they were kind of at the avant-garde of the new space industry. So I'd written a lot about new space and SpaceX and kind of the old guard, as it were. And so he had seen that reporting and just he was familiar with me when I approached him about the book.
In fact, I realized that when I was reading the book, I'm like, a lot of this is familiar. I know I've heard about it. And then I went back and looked, and you're the reason I was familiar. You had written those articles in Ars Technica. You're pretty much the only way I had known about what was going on. This is such an important story. And I just want to know, first of all, what was it like to meet and interview all of these legends in the space industry?
It really is an important story. And it's hard for me to believe that it really hadn't been told in full. Obviously, Ashley Vance's book on Elon Musk is a great book. He got a lot of things right in that and did so at a time when access was difficult to get. A lot of the people, in LIFTOFF told me that they really didn't feel comfortable talking to him back then for different reasons, most of all because, they might get crosswise with Elon, and even former employees really didn't want to do that. It was an opportunity to talk to all these people who were there at the beginning. And that was really my going in proposition is I wanted to tell the story of SpaceX, not just of Elon Musk, but of the people he hired and what they went through. And one of my big questions was, well, how much was it Elon? How much was it the team? And how did they persevere through all of these challenges? Those are the kind of questions I tried to answer for readers as well.
One of the things that I kind of learned from the book was that SpaceX was not the only commercial launch company that, started up with some founder who had a bunch of money, but a lot of them failed. How likely was it that a SpaceX was going to happen?
That was one of the things that's so interesting is, as you say, a lot of other people had come along and sounded a lot like Elon Musk when it came to rockets, right? It was no secret that the launch industry had really slowed down, that US rockets were very expensive, and there was the potential for disruption. But there's a lot of other people who had come along and said that they were going to become the FedEx of space, right? Getting satellites up there cheaply and frequently and reliably. And they all went bust for various reasons. That was one of the things that Tom Muller, he was the head of propulsion, told me that he liked and why he ultimately he was the first person actually to sign on as an employee at SpaceX. He said he'd heard a lot of people with good ideas about space and their design of their rockets, but maybe they didn't have enough money. Then there were people who had a lot of money, but bad ideas or were getting bad advice. What he liked about Elon is he had a pretty good idea about what he wanted to build. He thought it was realistic, and Elon had enough money. He ended up putting about $100 million ultimately into SpaceX at the beginning to get them to their first couple of launches. And so he kind of had the right mix. But even so, it was a very near thing. They almost didn't make it and ended up on the scrap heap of history like a lot of those other companies. His HR director told me that Elon personally interviewed the first 3,000 engineers hired at SpaceX. And that takes a lot of time. And Elon did that because he knew who he wanted. He wanted brilliant people, but he also wanted people who were willing to think creatively or differently. And of course, were willing to work hard. And so what you ended up with at SpaceX were people maybe who were not in it for salary. You were working 80 hours a week, and you really didn't know what the next day would bring because there was a new challenge or a new problem every day as you tackled all of these problems. And it was a small team, so you did many different things. And from the very beginning, he was talking about going to Mars, which seemed insane back in 2002. It seems slightly less so now, but that's a pretty wild vision to have 20 years ago when we had the space shuttle and not much else. I think that appealed to them. I think sort of being the underdogs appealed to them, and being the really disruptive force. And they all kind of bought into that mentality. It was us against the world. Zach Dunn, who's one of the characters in the book, who I think has a pretty great story, kind of describes it as the rest of the industry was kind of like classical music and sort of these bucolic country scenes of these beautiful rocket factories, and SpaceX is sort of this heavy metal band kind of out there, trashing the place and going as fast as they can.
You talked in the book about different, leaders of companies that either went bust or they all went bust. But usually the vision isn't so ambitious, and it's not to necessarily build a civilization on Mars. That's such a science fiction-y kind of goal. How important is that vision, do you think?
At the beginning, I don't think it was that important. It was important to Elon. It was a motivating factor for him. But I think for his earliest employees, it was enough the first step was to privately build an orbital rocket. Like Hans Koenigsmann said, what attracted him to the job was trying to do it with 150 people, not 15,000 people, and to try to do it with a off-the-shelf computer versus a $10,000 or $100,000 space-rated, circuit board. Because at the time, there'd been no privately developed orbital rockets launched from the ground. Pegasus was a solid drop from an airplane, but that's quite a bit different than building a liquid-fueled rocket engine and launching it from the ground. So no one had ever done that. And so trying to do that with private money was a novel thing. And then the next thing was, he had the idea that you were going to reuse the first stages. And then they tried to do that with the Falcon 1, even before the Falcon 9. But in general, I think more important to the early people was the idea of disrupting the launch industry. They were either veterans of it and knew what was going on, or they were in grad school and liked the idea of really trying to go fast and do things in a different way. And so Mars has become more important now as it's become a little more tangible. But yeah, back then it was more of sort of disrupting the status quo.
Now, I've always felt that Gwynne Shotwell, the president of SpaceX, is one of the main reasons why SpaceX is successful. And this got reinforced from reading your book and learning about all she does for SpaceX. What are your thoughts about Gwynne Shotwell and the relationship that she has with Elon?
Yeah, Gwynne is obviously, fabulous, and, really kept the business side afloat as the engineers were out there on Quadrillion trying to figure out launch. She's clearly an important figure in the history of the company. What I think is interesting about her is Elon is certainly controversial, a lightning rod, says things that are not PC. He has become an increasingly polarizing figure. He's in the billionaire class, so a lot of people don't like him for that. By contrast, Gwynne Shotwell is this high school cheerleader who is, attractive, dresses very stylishly, goes to conferences, and everyone adores her. Right. She's where all the places where Elon is sort of rough and has rough edges, she's smooth, right? She's this great figure. But when you strip away those veneers, they think very much the same. And that's why she actually went to work for Elon, is because she was frustrated with the industry and liked where he was trying to take it. And she's every bit as ruthless as he is in sort of pulling the space industry forward into the vision that they want to see. She's been absolutely critical to keeping SpaceX, on the rails. I think they've had fewer problems than Tesla in that regard because of Gwynne Shotwell. She smoothed relations over with the military after Elon was, smoking pot. That's not something the generals would like to see. And let's face it, the defense industry is an important customer for SpaceX now and absolutely for the future in terms of both Starship and Starlink. So you've got to have good relationships with the generals and the procurement officers to do that, and that's where Gwynne comes in. And as I wrote in the book, obviously she played a huge role in landing those first contracts. That the first one enabled them to really grow rapidly, and the second one saved them.
There's this pivotal moment in your book where basically, and this stood out to me, SpaceX has basically gotten to a point where you think, oh, it's downhill from here. They've landed this spot at Vandenberg Air Force Base. It's like prime spot, but then the Air Force is like, no, not so fast. And here is where I think what I understood from your book is that Gwynne was advocating for like, let's approach this the correct way with the Air Force. And Elon was kind of like you just said, just like, no, we're good to go. And it didn't work out, right? They were forced, basically, they couldn't do a launch until the Air Force was good and ready. And so the next step, now we find ourselves in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. And so that was, well, I don't know, stunning to me. If I was the leader of a company and I couldn't work with the Air Force, I don't think my next thought would be, oh, I'll just go to the spit of land in the middle of the Pacific. But that was Elon's next move. And I think this shows to me both his strengths and his weaknesses, right? I mean, he didn't trust a very important person in his team, Gwynne Shotwell, to handle it. But on the other side, when it wasn't going well, he came up with a solution. He pivoted. Can you tell me about your thoughts about that point in their history?
So that's really an important moment. They'd completed a static fire test of the Falcon 1 rocket. And that was the last big test before launching. And it was Vandenberg was perfect for them because you can reach polar orbits from that launch site because you can launch toward, due south, basically. And it was only a few hours north of the factory. So logistically, it was pretty straightforward for them to launch from there. The Air Force had just financed our Big Atlas launch pad for Lockheed Martin that was nearby the SpaceX pad, and they were concerned about damage there. And there was also a very valuable National Reconnaissance Office payload on a Titan rocket that was not far away. And so the Air Force and the NRO just basically said, you're not launching until the Titan launches, and we can't tell you when that's going to be. And that's really the difference between commercial space and sort of traditional space. Because in a commercial space company, you're privately funding your efforts. So if the government tells you you've got to wait 6 months, that's 6 months of salaries, tooling, benefits, hardware, you're just eating those costs. Whereas if you're a traditional space company and the government says, well, we don't need this launch for 6 months, they just continue to pay you for that. So that's why he was really forced to take that option, to go to another launch site, because he could not literally afford to wait. And so, SpaceX had spent 6 months building up the Vandenberg site in a frenetic pace. Then all of a sudden they had to go 8,000 miles away. Literally, you cannot find a piece of land further from a continental landmass really than the Kwajalein Atoll. But the Army was in charge of that range. They were looking for customers to come in and launch from there. And so that it kind of worked out that it fell into place. The only problem was, you're launching from 8,000 miles away from your factory in the middle of the ocean where there's virtually no launch infrastructure.
I can't imagine being Elon at that moment. First of all, picking a spot that's so far from human civilization that you have to get all that equipment to, and then people to, and basically he had to tell his team, okay, you're going to go out in the middle of the Pacific for weeks and months on end. Tell me about how Elon draws these people to work for him. Basically, it seems like there's two types of people to me. There's either the people who are just like, yes, I'm in, whatever you want, Elon. And then there's people who I think don't quite know what they're getting into maybe, but find themselves working their butts off for him, giving their blood, sweat, and tears for him. What's his secret? How does he do it?
I think it's a mix of, kind of charisma. Even back then he was, he could be pretty inspiring in his own way with this grand vision and sort of this disruptive status, right? He was already successful. He'd made a couple $100 million from PayPal. And so they could look up to him as someone who had success, and he had this compelling vision, and he was smart, right? He is smart. He's actually, probably the smartest person I've ever met. And so he was pretty impressive in his own sort of awkward, way. And I think that was one thing. He had funding, so he had these crazy ideas, but he also had the resources to bring them about. And he was building a good team, and people wanted to be part of that. Prospective hires told me they would go down there at this little factory in El Segundo, and they would meet the people, and they'd be sort of swept up in the mania.
When you go to write your second book, Touchdown or whatever. I'm not saying you have to write a second book. I loved your first one. I just find that there's this amazing pivot towards the end of the book where they've finally gotten their first successful launch. And then they start like, okay, well, let's start, making this new version of the Falcon 1. We'll do some launches with it. And then Elon basically comes in and says, no, we're not going to do any more launches with the Falcon 1. So they did one launch with the Falcon 1, and then it was immediately over to the Falcon 9. The whole book is about the Falcon 1 and getting it to launch, and they launched it once, and that was enough. It was like a magical moment where suddenly they got this big contract from NASA. And I mean, how crazy is it for some of the people who worked on Falcon 1 to just immediately just drop it and it goes away? I mean, without your book, it could have just faded into history.
Elon is not one for really looking back. He's always looking forward. And I would not characterize him as being sentimental. So yes, he had put 6 years of his life and money into the Falcon 1 too. But when he realized pretty quickly when NASA stepped up with, $278 million of development funding for the Falcon 9 and Cargo Dragon spacecraft, and then was offering, more than $1 billion for missions to the space station, that was the opportunity for SpaceX to go from kind of this little niche launch company to a major player. And so they were all in on the future. And I think you can look at SpaceX as kind of like stepping stones, right? The first step is to prove that you can actually build an orbital rocket. And the Falcon 1 is not a big rocket. It's about a half a ton to LEO was the ultimate, capacity of it. But then once you do that, there's a very limited amount of things you can do with that rocket. It's small satellites basically, and that's it. And so the next step then is to build a much larger rocket that can do a lot more things. It could potentially even, carry humans into space on a Falcon 9, which obviously came to pass. And that was also a really good test bed for reusability. So the first decade was kind of like showing you could build an orbital rocket with a small team, private money for low cost. And really sort of during that time too, they they proved out the vertical integration idea, right? They built as much of the Falcon 1 as they could in-house, just like they're doing with the Falcon 9 with the Merlin engine, like they did, they're doing with Starship and the Raptor engine. And so they got the orbital rocket down. Then I think it was sort of building a much larger rocket and flying humans. And really the most important piece, I think, of the last decade was reuse. You alluded to there with your use of touchdown. And then obviously the third phase of the company will actually be deep space exploration, which is what they hope to do with Starship.
Now, Elon does not shy away from rivalries. On the Tesla side, he's always kind of poking the bear with BMW and VW and so forth. On the space side, there's two ongoing rivalries right now. I'd love your thoughts on the first one being between Elon and Jeff Bezos.
Yeah, so it's not really much of a rivalry anymore.
Jeff who?
It's interesting. You go back to the end of 2015, and it was this really promising era because in November that year, Bezos landed New Shepard for the first time successfully. This was actually the first vertical takeoff and landing of a rocket. Now, suborbital rocket is about 3% of the energy required for an orbital rocket. So when SpaceX did the same thing with the Falcon 9 a month later, it was a more significant deal. But that was Bezos's famous "Welcome to the club" tweet, and that took Elon certainly did not appreciate that at all because he understood. So, but at that time, there were already the basic building blocks of a rivalry because Bezos had sued SpaceX for trying to do landing on a drone ship because that idea was patented. They'd fought over Launch Complex 39A in Florida to launch from. That's where Elon famously said, unicorns dancing in a flame duct before they would do an orbital rocket. And by the way, he was not wrong about that. Blue Origin orbital rocket, New Glenn, probably doesn't fly until at least 2023, in my opinion. And obviously Falcon 9 will have flown 200 times by then, probably. At the end of 2015, it seemed like we were in set for this fantastic race among these two ambitious billionaires. Both wanted to build large, reusable rockets. But since then, New Shepard's flown like 15 times. The Falcon 9's launched 120 times. It's launched 3 crew missions. It's launched 20 cargo missions or 15 more cargo missions. It's launched, more satellites than any country or company in the world. And they're building Starship. I mean, there's really no comparison to what SpaceX has done and what Blue Origin has done since then. And so while there is still a rivalry, like one company is executing and one just is not for a variety of reasons. That I could go into if you wanted to. But anyway, that's my answer to that one.
Yeah, I mean, I'd love to know more about, so basically SpaceX just got the contract, or we thought they did, from NASA to go to the moon. And then, looks like it's being contested. First of all, where do you think that's going to end up?
I suspect that the Government Accountability Office, and we do expect a ruling, I guess, in about a month on that. I think the administrator, Bill Nelson, said it was going to be August 4th or earlier for that. I would suspect the GAO upholds that because if you go and look at the underlying documents, SpaceX had the superior bid. So there's really no reason, for Blue Origin's protest other than Jeff Bezos was mad as hell after that. And so they had to file this protest, which was hundreds of pages. So we'll see. I mean, the GAO could uphold that protest, but I don't think that will happen.
I mean, from a non-space nerd perspective, I mean, I follow it, but I'm not like knowing every last detail like you. It seems like SpaceX is the obvious choice to go to the moon. But so it seems a little, I don't know, like bad sportsmanship that you would call foul to that. But, what's your perspective? Does Jeff have a chance here?
There's 2 reasons why NASA chose SpaceX ultimately. First of all was the price. Congress had only given them a limited amount of funding for the human landing system. They said they needed, more than $3 billion this fiscal year, and they got $850 million. And so NASA basically looked at the numbers and said, okay, if we really want to try to land on the moon in the next several years, we can only afford one lander, and there's one lander that fits within our budget, and that's SpaceX. So number 1 was price. Number 2 is the engineers at NASA are not stupid, right? Who runs the human spaceflight program at NASA? It's Kathy Loiters. She spent a decade involved in the commercial crew program. So she saw very intimately how SpaceX worked and how Boeing worked, right? So it's the new space versus old space. And who delivered for 40% less money, at least 2 years ahead of Boeing on commercial crew? It was the upstart SpaceX, who had no experience in human spaceflight whatsoever. So she's looking at bids from SpaceX, which has been the contractor that has delivered the most for NASA for the least amount of money over the last decade. A team led by Blue Origin and some old space players. And Blue Origin has nothing to point to other than New Shepard, which is a great little rocket, but it's not orbital, and it's certainly not getting you to the moon. And then there's Dynetics, whose bid was technically found to be very challenging, and the budget was, super high. So she picked the company that had executed for NASA and was most likely to continue executing. And oh, by the way, while these other companies had delivered basically plywood mock-ups to Johnson Space Center of their landers, SpaceX was building Starship, blowing them up, but there was real hardware. I mean, the engines were real, the propulsion systems are real, the tanks are real. In retrospect, it was a pretty easy choice, but at the time, it sure seemed like the national team, because it had this fusion, right? You had Bezos's billions, Blue Origin was new space, and you had sort of the experienced hands of Lockheed to go along with a couple other companies. But now the decision makes sense. Again, it's hard for me to see the GAO overturning that.
And so, I mean, that was one rivalry, which it seems like SpaceX has gotten past to a certain extent. But the next is ULA, United Launch Alliance. Elon has been tweeting on Twitter, as he usually does, and poking a much bigger bear this time, I think, arguably.
So I would say that 5 years ago, ULA was the bigger bear. But now SpaceX is surpassed them. The Falcon 9 is now considered more reliable than the Atlas V. It costs less to insure launches on the Falcon 9. Obviously, SpaceX can fly it for probably a third of the cost of an Atlas V. And they're winning now the bulk of a lot of NASA's science missions, all the commercial missions that they go head to head with ULA. So it's been interesting. He has been going after Tory Bruno, and Tory Bruno, who everyone kind of generally likes, and it's in a difficult position. ULA is co-owned by Boeing and Lockheed, so they can't really do anything without the permission of both parents, and that really actually constrains his ability to respond to these considerable challenges posed by SpaceX. I mean, would you want to be flying a medium or heavy lift rocket in the United States and trying to compete against SpaceX? I sure wouldn't. Yeah, Elon's really been going after Toy, and I was trying to figure out why. What's provoking him? Because there is no love lost between ULA and SpaceX and vice versa. They may talk nice sometimes, and Gwen and Tory may talk nice, but those two companies have been hammer and tongs for more than a decade. There was a lawsuit even before ULA formed from SpaceX back in 2005. But Elon's been going after Tory lately, and I think it's because Tory Bruno a few weeks ago testified in Congress about all these Starlink satellites were a threat to the launch industry, because it really there were more conjunction possibilities during launch, and so it was limiting the launch windows, and it was making that more difficult. And so it was talking about orbital debris, and I think Elon just looked at that and just said and just decided he was going to go after their business model. And oh, by the way, not much of what Elon said is wrong, right? ULA did get $1 billion a year subsidy for years and years and years, and Boeing and Lockheed are not in it to make human multiplanetary. No one is in it to make humans multiplanetary except for Elon, really. If I were, sort of assigning a scale of nobility to intentions, I would put SpaceX and sort of its intentions to try to get humans to settle on other planets much higher than I would sort of ahead of the Boeing and Lockheed's desire to take profits from ULA.
How important is it to blow up rockets? Because SpaceX does it a whole lot, mostly with the Starship. Obviously Falcon 9, they don't do that hardly much anymore because it's already developed. But like when you're developing a rocket, why is it important that they're blowing up rockets as opposed to waiting, making sure that they have everything all set and perfect?
So, I mean, that's another big sort of innovation he brought in. And I think it comes from his software background, where you write some code, run the program and see what happens. And then you have bugs and you debug it and you run it again and then you debug it again. Same kind of thing with rockets is, so when you're designing a launch vehicle or a spacecraft, these are super complex systems, right? And so there's so many different parts that have to work together for the vehicle to go up or to, fly straight or whatever. So, you can do analysis or paralysis by analysis for years and sort of try to figure out all the different systems. And then your engineers will be like, well, wait a minute. if this happens and this happens, then the rocket could blow up. So we need to add another part, or we need to add some thermal shielding, or we need to add some whatever. And so as Elon says, your launch vehicle becomes fettered with widgets, and all of these widgets are there to sort of to take care of these contingencies that might happen during launch, right? Well, this engine could, heating could affect another engine, so we need to put some more insulation there, and you just sort of you build up the mass and you lower the performance of your rocket. And so this can go on for years and years and years. And his philosophy is simply to build it with what we think will work, and we'll find out the problems, we'll find out what goes wrong, and we'll fix that, and we'll fly it again, and we'll find out what goes wrong. And instead of spending 5 years in the design and development phase, we'll do design and we'll just jump right to test, right? And it's faster, it's cheaper, but you blow things up. The problem that NASA has, and the big contractors that NASA has traditionally funded, is, if you're Boeing and you build a big rocket for NASA and it blows up, your stockholders are going to be angry. Congress is going to be upset. And so NASA really is in a position where they can't fail, right? Because publicly it looks very bad for them. And so you have this linear design method, which we've seen with the Space Launch System rocket, this big NASA rocket that may launch early next year after more than a decade and $20 billion of development. And then you have Starship, which really development got going in 2017, 2018. And now, may make an orbital flight attempt, later this year. And it's just remarkable. With the SLS rocket, they already had the engines, right? They're just reusing space shuttle main engines. They had the solid rocket boosters. They just added a segment to each of them. This is 45 or 50-year-old technology. And then they're just using, liquid hydrogen, liquid oxygen tanks. And again, this is decades old technology. So you're really just taking, instead of 3 shuttle main engines, you're taking 4, and you've got this big core stage. And yeah, there's some pretty hairy engineering in there. You're doing some friction stir welding and things like that. But that is very much a traditional traditional approach to space, whereas Starship, man, the technical thickets they're trying to get through a Starship are incredible. And they've gone much faster and for much less money. And it's because of the iterative design approach versus the linear design approach.
I mean, this is insane, right? Because, as we watch Starship, SN1 through SN16 and so forth, they're just launch, some failure, some successes. To the general public, it must look like they just blow things up. But to a veteran who's watching this, you're seeing just amazing progress. How is Elon able to do it on such incredible timelines? Because he'll tweet something out that sounds absurd. He'll say next year we'll be doing this, and everyone's like, what? And then a lot of times he hits it. How is he able to do it?
Let's be honest. He demands long hours from his teams. I remember when I was reporting for the book, I was out there in September of 2019, and I was sitting in on a Starship meeting, sort of watching him and his team work to see sort of his leadership style. If you remember, on September 28th, 2019, they had that first Starship reveal event where he got up and spoke in front of Starship in South Texas, and this big shiny thing in the background. This was 2 weeks before that. And they had already come out and set the date for that event. So they had to make it. And they had minute by minute schedule for the next 2 weeks of all that had to get done to make sure that when he got up there on the stage, that there was a rocket behind him. And it was 24 hours a day, right? So he has these, he sets these insane expectations for his workers. And that's why you've got to be bought in to work for SpaceX, because while some projects today are not 80 hours a week, I can tell you the people in Boca Chica, the engineers are probably working 80 hours a week. To keep that program moving forward. And it's a couple of things. First of all, it's the fact that people work for him hard and he drives them hard. That's so one of the most compelling things about Elon that I found in reporting the book. He has this enormous internal drive to move forward, always. He just always has this internal pressure to keep things moving forward. Whereas you or I on the weekend might just kick back and watch a sports game or go to the beach or something like that. It's with him, he's always how can I go faster? How can I do it better? And how can I do it for less money? And like those are like the three questions that drive his decision making. And it's the iterative design that we talked about. Like it's not okay to fail, but it's okay to fail. Like if something bad happens, you'll learn from it and you'll move forward. Especially with Starship. Like for a long time, there was no NASA oversight, right? It was just the FAA saying, "Look, you can't explode your rocket over a populated area." And that was basically it. So they could go as fast as they wanted, and that's the way they did the Falcon 1 too. They had very little oversight. Falcon 9 was slower because they were, it was for NASA.
Let's say, budget necessarily wasn't much of an issue, and you could just hire twice as many people and have them all work 40 hours a week. Do you think that they would be able to make the same progress?
Well, I don't think they would get to that point because Elon would not be cool with he would not want to look around his company and see like this workforce, to work in 8-hour days. That's just not how he rolls. Liftoff obviously is about the early years of SpaceX, and it's a truly compelling story, which is why I just sort of wanted to tell that story, because it's as you say, it's every bit as important as the Apollo moon landings, I think, in our spaceflight, in the arc of our spaceflight history. But one of the most impressive things to me is that SpaceX today has gone from David to Goliath in the launch industry. Well, there's no question about it. Everyone in the world looks up to them with envy and their launch vehicles and their cadence and all this other stuff. But they're not resting on their laurels. They're still like every bit the disruptive force they were 19 years ago. And so like Elon has been able to keep that founder's mentality as he's gone from 3 to 10 to 100 to 1,000 to 10,000 employees. It's still like, we're the underdogs. We're not going fast enough. And so, yeah, I don't ever see them going to 40-hour work weeks. And now you did say, if they had more money, and what's interesting about Starship now is for the first time, they're much less resource constrained than they used to be. Both with the NASA funding, but also because Elon has his own personal wealth, and SpaceX has achieved so much that they can go raise money at will on the private capital markets. So what we're seeing in Starship is like, for the first time, I think, the full flowering of his expectations in terms of development and speed. I mean, it is so hard to build super heavy rockets like they've done with Starship. I mean, that thing rolling out looked ridiculous, this tall, cylinder, but man, that launch tower, that is insanely difficult stuff to do. If NASA was given that charge in 2010 to build that, they'd be 5 years away from where Starship and Super Heavy are now. It's just it's amazing what they've been able to do.
How important is Boca Chica to SpaceX? The fact that they found this little spot where they can it's their sandbox where they can kind of do what they want.
Well, I mean, it's very important because it's as you say, it's been a sandbox where they've been able to innovate. And a couple of years ago, they were actually if you remember, they had 2 Starship development teams. They had one in Florida and then one in Boca Chica, and they kind of gave up on Florida. I think partly because they were having success in Texas, and partly because it's just trying to do stuff on the Space Coast is more difficult because you've got NASA and the Air Force and all these other sort of people looking over your head. In South Texas, they've had much more leeway, obviously. And it was about a year and a half ago or 2 years ago where Elon decided to go all in on Texas. And they have really, really hired quickly there. I don't know what the current headcount is. In 2019, it was like 50 people. In 2020, it was like hundreds and hundreds. And you look at that site today, and it's just a beehive. So he's gone all in on Texas, and it's hard to see that changing again because, one of the reasons why they started doing their engine testing in McGregor back in 2002 is that it was a large place and they were unconstrained, so they could do a lot of what they wanted to do. And so he definitely likes the ability to move as quickly as possible, and Texas allows him to do that.
Oh yeah, I just wanted to ask about Texas. It seems like this does really fit the whether it's the government or the personality of Texas kind of fits Elon in space a lot because he's got freedoms there, and it seems like he's building a new base for new star base, and it seems to be attracting talent. Can you talk more about was this a good move? Because normally it's California or it's Florida, but this, I mean, there's always been a history, of course, with Houston and so forth with NASA, but it just seems like he's drawing talent there now, and I assume he's almost building a city there now.
Yeah, I mean, that's one of the big challenges because historically, for 50 years, 60 years, the nucleus of aerospace engineering talent in this country has been in Southern California. So that's where a lot of the best schools are. That's where the people with experience were. And so that's where almost all the rocket companies were started. It's been difficult to get a lot of those people to go to Texas. And so that's why a lot of people, I think, in South Texas are younger, who are sort of willing to just, it's like the kids in LIFTOFF. Like, they were all in their early 20s. They didn't have families. They didn't have responsibilities. And so they could just up and move to Kwajalein. It's kind of like Texas is the new Kwajalein for Starship. And since Elon has been spending so much time there, that really has increased its importance. Like wherever he is where the center of gravity for that company is. Gwen Shotwell now spends a lot of time in Texas. And so that's where it's happening for the company. He's clearly bet big on it. I'm always reminded of a conversation I had with Jeff Grayson, who founded XCore, which was he was trying to build a Lynx space plane to do suborbital space tourism, not unlike Virgin Galactic, but on a smaller scale. And he moved his company from California to Midland, Texas. And he said it was the best day. Moving from California to Texas was the best day of his life, because the regulatory environment in Texas is so much different than California. And that's not to say California is bad. There's so many great things about California. But if you want to operate a business with fewer constraints, lower taxes, Texas is a much better environment than California. It's just the challenge Elon faced was getting the talent there, because there's not much in South Texas to draw upon.
So it seems like one of Elon's most vital resources is talented 20-year-olds who are willing to go to literal ends of the earth to work their butts off through kind of the prime of their life. Do you think that this resource is going to be increasing with some of the inspiring stuff that Elon has done? So, inspiring some of the, the 14, 15, 16-year-olds to maybe go into aerospace engineering, whereas maybe they wouldn't before, but maybe they saw, Starman in his roadster floating around the earth, and they're going to think like, wow, I want to do that.
First of all, you're absolutely right. Like, he draws upon young engineers. I remember in a Raptor meeting in California, looking around the room, and these were like sort of the people who were leading the Raptor engine program. So like, the best people, because engines are the hardest part of a rocket. And there were a couple of people in their 30s and 40s, but mostly it was, young people in their 20s. And Elon at this point was in his late 40s and sort of is still sort of going out and tapping into this talent. So yes, I wholly agree with you on that. I think that's one of the reasons why he was, willing to do the book now. And certainly his HR director, Brian Beldy, was eager to have something like this to inspire young people about sort of aerospace engineering. And I know Elon, it's interesting, like, we've had discussions about this in the past, and he's much more like, because I'd say, well, like, you're going to start flying humans that pretty soon. That's going to inspire a lot of people. He's like, no, we don't want to inspire young people to be astronauts. We want to inspire them to be engineers. And so I think that's one of the things with LIFTOFF that I think that really comes through, is that the heroes of the stories are the technicians and the engineers who actually went through these enormous challenges and just all these difficulties and persevered to launch the Falcon 1. And so I think that's one of the things he liked about the book ultimately.
Yeah, I just want to thank you, because I knew little tidbits of this story, but you put it all together in such a just fascinating and readable way. And I think this is an important book that should be a part of our schools' curriculums. I really think that we need to, if you're watching now and you're a school administrator, we need to start replacing some of the outdated 1700s books with books that are telling our kids the stories of recent history, important history. This is inspirational. This is getting kids to understand teamwork and stick-to-itiveness and never giving up and engineering. And you're right, it makes engineers into heroes. And so, yeah, I don't know. I feel like this is a book that should be read by all kids starting probably middle school, high school, because it could shape the way that kids look at the future and their own futures. I think a lot of kids today, they look at, I could be a basketball player, I could be, president. They're not really
Instagram model.
Exactly.
I could be right.
A social media star. They're not really seeing, it's hard as a kid to understand how you fit, what is an engineer and how does that fit in? This book really shows you that these are smart people, obviously, but they were just willing to take the risk and they're willing to work hard. And that put them on teams that did incredible things.
I think that's exactly right. Like, the heroes of the story are engineers. And that's really like, it's Elon's I think, identity is as an engineer. He sees these enormous problems and then tries to tackle them. And it was interesting, like, he was not in every meeting. He was not at every test, right? He had other things. He had Tesla going on. He had, he's got lots of things on his time. But when the most important decisions were made, he was the one who was there and he was making them. And it was from an engineering standpoint of like, what are the most important problems? How do we solve those? And it was really like he would push his people to find new ways to solve these challenges. And like, as I think I write in the book, the last thing he ever wants to hear is that's the way it's always been done. He wants to find new ways to do things. And I think that lesson is so important for our world today because we have all these problems. And a lot of the things we've been doing for 50 or 100 years, which once worked, no longer do. So it's this great sort of problem solving approach. And I think that's one of the things that draws me to Elon so much. He lots of people personally don't like him for various reasons, and I understand that. But at the end of the day, here's someone who's looking at the biggest problems facing the world and actually trying to solve them. Just, I would look at climate change and I say, man, that's really a shame. I'm going to get a more fuel efficient car, but it's nothing. There's not much I can do about it. It's a global problem. Elon's like, we're going to build electric cars and solar power and try to, it's very admirable in that sense. And the same thing with humanity's vulnerable as long as it's confined to one planet. So let's do what we can to, start living in other places.
Do you think that SpaceX is accelerated by kind of the fan club that's grown up around it? That, I mean, NASA has always been popular with people. It's always, very inspiring to think about, astronauts on the International Space Station and especially the moon missions. But there wasn't as much interaction. There wasn't as much like excitement about rocket launches. I mean, with most SpaceX launches, you get a launch and a landing, and then you get the second stage. So it's more exciting, and there's a lot of people interested in SpaceX. Do you think that that's going to help SpaceX forward, even if those people aren't necessarily engineers?
I do think NASA has recognized the fact that when you have SpaceX as part of a mission, you get more public attention. And they appreciate that, and they've sort of tried to up their game. And I know that Boeing's response to when SpaceX did the Demo 2 mission, actually Demo 1 and Demo 2 missions, where they had these sort of really flashy webcasts, and with the crowds cheering in the background, like the Boeing response was, well, we've got to figure out a way to one up that, or to sort of match that or exceed that energy, because it raised the game in terms of public perception so much. So I don't know if that helps SpaceX. I think it sort of fits in with the idea of like what company has delivered for NASA over the last decade. And the fact that SpaceX sort of brings added attention is good. Now, on the other hand, there's a lot of people in Congress who don't like SpaceX. So, it kind of cuts a little bit both ways, but certainly it helps NASA when there's more attention and interest in space, and SpaceX absolutely brings that.
When you thought of writing this book, and I assume you reached out to Elon and then you got the thumbs up, did you ever pinch yourself and go like, I'm on Elon's jet right now, and there's Kimball and there's Elon, and I'm doing this?
I mean, there were some difficult times, right in the book, but absolutely. I think what I pinch myself more is not sort of, being around Elon but sort of as a writer, I got to take the first crack at this story. It was interesting. A couple of weeks ago, Tim Buzza, who was the launch director for the Falcon 1, had a liftoff party. It was after COVID. So he invited everyone. And so like a lot of the people, pretty much everyone in the book was there. And like some of the people there hadn't seen each other for 5 or 10 years. So it was A, to celebrate the book, and B, to sort of celebrate the fact that they could all get back together and have a reunion of sorts. It was just pretty amazing to see them as a team there. And so they, at the end of it, sort of, they watched the video and then they had me give a little speech, and I got up and I just said, look, this is a hell of a story. And like, as a writer, I sort of, when I pinch myself is that I was the person that happened to be in the right place at the right time and got to tell this story, because it's a great story, and it's the beginning of what could become the transformational space company, of the century.
What was the response from people in the book? I know that Elon gave the world's shortest book review. He said, "Just read it. Book is accurate," which in Elon speak means everything. So that was awesome. But yeah, what did the team members feel about the book?
They loved it. They loved it because, a lot of them had thought about writing books of their own, right? And they told me, well, I didn't write it because I'm not a very good writer, or I didn't write it because, I wasn't sure how Elon would react to it, or, and so they were by and large very grateful that I had come along, and had sort of talked to all them and stitched together their various stories into this narrative. They were very happy with that, and the fact that the book really focused on the company and sort of tried to bring out the roles that other people played as well.
What are your thoughts going forward with SpaceX? There's a lot of big things in the future for SpaceX. There's, missions to go around the moon with artists. There's missions to land on the moon. There's missions to go to Mars. Elon puts very amazing timetables on these things. Like it could be in the next few years, according to Elon, that we'd be crewed to Mars. But what are your thoughts? Like, do you think this is going to happen this decade and we're going to be just mind blown again? Or what do you think?
I'm of the mind that humans to Mars is incredibly difficult. And so if it happens by the mid 2030s, that will be a Herculean achievement. So I don't expect to see humans on Mars in the 2020s. But frankly, if SpaceX didn't exist, I wouldn't expect to see humans on Mars in my lifetime. But now I do, because I think they'll in concert with NASA, they'll ultimately get there. NASA brings funding, but more importantly, it brings sort of all the regulatory issues and sort of international things, just planetary protection, all this other stuff that you really need to go to Mars. But it's an interesting future because there's so much possibility, but there's also risks, right? Elon is now 50. He has done this amazingly demanding grind for 20 years now. So how long can he keep that up? I mean, he's done it so far. But that's it's wearing emotionally and physically on him. I know that for a fact. And then if they have like a setback with a human mission, God forbid, on Crew Dragon, Falcon 9, that'll be a very significant setback for the commercial crew program. Obviously, in terms of human life lost, but also just it's going to bring the critics in Congress and elsewhere in the industry down on them, incredibly hard. And then, finally, Starlink has a lot of promise, but it is the first of many satellite internet constellations that are going up. OneWeb, Project Kuiper, China, Europe, all these other places are talking about it. From an orbital debris perspective, that's a real concern as well, that we could follow up orbit enough that you could really stunt the growth of commercial space. So there's lots of headwinds, I think, but ultimately, SpaceX is about engineering, and there are lots of problems to solve to get to Mars, and they're very good at solving problems. And so I think we'll get there. And it's just amazing to think about that, because I'm not sure the average person or non-space geek, non-space nerd, whatever you call me, was accurate, because I live and breathe space, because it's just, I'm very passionate about it. But going to the moon is really hard, but it's a hell of a lot easier than going to Mars, for so many different reasons. And so what I like about Starship, and what I think is an important point for you guys to understand, is up until now, every conversation we've ever had about humans to Mars has been theoretical, because the first step to getting someone to Mars and back is to have a transportation system. And no system ever designed and built before or under design now, except for Starship, could make that a reality. It's just nothing exists today that gets people to Mars on the surface and back. And so now that we're starting to build the transportation system, you can start to have a realistic conversation about what those missions would actually look like. And there's many other things you need, you need life support all the way there. You need power systems on the surface of Mars. You need habitat on Mars. You need planetary protection. You need food, water, all this other crap. But it's no longer theoretical. It's much more grounded in reality, because you can start with, okay, you've got this rocket, it can launch this many times, it costs this much per launch, and it's really a fascinating time from that perspective. One of the reasons that Elon is compelling to me is that I buy into the idea that the future of humanity is among the stars. I guess I read enough enough science fiction novels as a kid to, and Jeff Bezos actually speaks very eloquently about this as well. He talks about, okay, if humanity is going to remain on Earth forever, eventually we're going to grow and reach a stasis point, at which point we're really going to stop moving forward as a species, because we're not going to be growing, we're going to be shrinking. And you already see that, like in Japan, lots of places around the world where population rates are declining. And by the second half of this century, like declining population will be a serious concern. The one answer to that is like you expand outward, right? You find new resources, but then, humans learn to live elsewhere. And ultimately, there's nothing close to an Earth in our solar system. There's lots of really, really inhospitable places, but we don't have the technology to get to other stars yet, right? That's in the future. But we're starting to have the technology to live, to learn how to live on other worlds. And so I think, people say, well, Mars is really cold and you die and all this stuff. And that's right. Mars sucks, right? It's not close to Earth. Antarctica is a beach destination compared to Mars, but it's the best first step, and you got to start somewhere. And I think that's where Elon comes from. It's like, you got to start somewhere, and Mars is the best first step. So we're going to go, he's all in on Mars. And I agree with that. I think, it's not great, but it's better than nothing, and you got to start somewhere.
Do you think SpaceX has changed the conversation in Congress at all? Do you think he's starting to get some credibility there, or do you think it's still a ULA world where it's like, no, it's just defense contractors, and that's all that matters?
Well, it's really the ULA world, and then the Boeing world with the Space Launch System, and Lockheed with the Orion spacecraft. The success of Crew Dragon was so important because that was SpaceX launching humans, which is the most important thing a rocket company can do. And they did it successfully, and they did it well before Boeing. That was really a strong statement. They've also changed the conversation around reusability, and that has happened far more quickly than I thought it would. This year we've seen humans launch on a reusable rocket for the first time, reusable aside from the space shuttle, and we've seen the GPS, one of the most important national defense missions, go up on a reusable rocket. So there's like no other holy grail barriers. Like reusable rockets are entirely mainstream now, and that's because of SpaceX. Where we haven't seen this conversation change yet is deep space exploration. So like that is like the last bastion of traditional space. Like only NASA can build rockets and spacecraft to take humans to the moon, right? Because we can't trust our commercial companies to do that. But under Jim Bridenstine, they said, we're going to do the lunar lander commercial. And they've stuck to it. And Congress didn't like it. Congress pushed back. And Congress obviously only funded it a little bit. And so it was really an incredible move by NASA in April when they selected SpaceX, because that basically said to Congress, hey, you're only going to give us this amount of money? We're going to pick the company that we think can do it. And you're going to hate that. So you're going to have to give us more money. But so it's changed everywhere, I think, except for deep space exploration. But if Starship is successful, then that conversation changes as well.
Eric, thank you so much for your time. If our viewers are watching right now and you're looking for a good summer read, Liftoff is that book. I can't recommend it enough. It's just a fantastic book. You should share it with all of your friends, especially, like I said, young people. It could change their lives. Right. So super important.
It's not too long. It packs away nicely. Mm-hmm. I know everyone's going to be traveling. Mm-hmm. I seriously recommend it. I like, you can just pick it up and get through like a little chapter. Tells a little story. It's so nice to read. So much about space travel and rockets is so dense, so complicated, and you distill all of these concepts that are usually, I don't know, college course level, or at least you have to play Kerbal Space Program for a while to understand. You break those down into such bite-sized chunks. I want to thank you so much for writing it. It's such an important piece of history. Thank you so much, Eric.
Oh, thank you. You guys have been so kind about that, and I appreciate that. Thank you.
Well, we're definitely going to have you back. Do you have any new projects you're working on? Are you just going to keep plugging away at reporting on space? Because we love reading all of your articles.
I mean, I'm going to continue plugging away on space, and I do have a book project on hopefully the next chapter on SpaceX. We'll see where that goes.
It's called Touchdown.
Maybe.
Well, we're definitely going to look forward to it. We'll definitely have you back. Thank you so much, Eric. It's been a pleasure talking to you today.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed that interview. Hit subscribe for more and hit the like button if you liked it. We'll see you next week. Now you know.